The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
It's probably fair to say that everyone is fed up with COVID-19. As we try to navigate the second wave, will COVID fatigue get the better of us? We'll consider that tonight. Then our Ontario Hubs explore how learning Indigenous languages is reconnecting people with community. And from examining Ontario's handling of COVID-19 and long-term care, to exposing harmful conspiracy theories about human trafficking, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, November 27th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. The last thing any one of us wanted this week was lockdown take 2. And in the most densely populated parts of the province, that became a reality and took millions back to some of the strictest measures of last spring. Not everyone is taking it all in stride, with some pushing back at this new round of restrictions. With us now from Ontario's capital on COVID fatigue and the week's developments, Dr. Anna Banerji, infectious disease specialist and associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Toronto, and Jennifer Pagliaro, City Hall reporter for the Toronto Star. I was joking with you both before we started taping that this week has felt like a very long month. So we're glad to have you here to break down some of the week's developments. I'm going to start with a poll from Ipsos. It's a new Ipsos poll for Global News, and it finds that half of Canadians, 48%, say that they're getting tired of following public health recommendations and rules regarding COVID-19, including 15% who strongly agree and 32% who somewhat agree. Fatigue is most pronounced among Generation Z, 57%, Gen X at 53%, and Millennial, 50% of Canadians. Dr. Banerji, I would like to start with you. You know, as we grapple with the second wave, I think we knew the second wave was coming before, I know we've been covering it from March. As we grapple with the second wave of this pandemic, what do you attribute to this fatigue?
Well, COVID has impacted everyone. People have lost their jobs or have modified their way of living. People have lost income. They're staying at home. They're stressed. So a lot of people have anxiety. We were told, wear a mask, physical distance, wash your hands. And everyone did that. Everyone stayed at home when they first told us to. We've made a lot of sacrifices. But when you make sacrifices, you expect a reward. And so far, there's no reward. So I think that people are really tired. We thought it was going to get better in the summer. We all did, we were all in it together, and then the numbers are going up again. It's been 9 months, and I think that and we're told that probably it'll get worse before it gets better. So I think there's a lot of reasons why people are tired.
And people have had to make, because sometimes when I do hear the term COVID fatigue, it sounds as if people are just over it, when in fact, the points that you mentioned, people losing their jobs, people not being able to see their families. But, how do we get people to understand that the situation now is just as severe, if not worse, compared to what we endured in the spring without contributing to further COVID fatigue? Dr. Banerji?
Well, I think that one of the problems that we're seeing is that there's an inconsistency as far as, federal, provincial, local messaging. And I think that sticking to the facts, going back to simple principles, we know COVID is spread when people get together. This is why we do what we do. I think also looking at, that there is a light, at the end of the tunnel, that we can do these measures, have it based in science, and that eventually this will end. And I think that way we can try to get people to continue to do the things they need to do. I mean, I think it will be a difficult winter, but then at the end of this, I think that things will get better.
Jennifer, Dr. Banerji mentioned, at the beginning, we had a sense of we're all in this together. We had the posters in the window. And now we have different types of posters saying end the lockdown. How much of a role has this fatigue played in the spread of misinformation and disinformation around COVID? Jennifer?
Yeah, I think the things that Dr. Banerjee said is so important, and you see now how that being tired with this pandemic, and as she said, not just being tired, but losing income, losing work, losing all of these different things for our families have contributed to people spreading misinformation about how severe this virus is, about the science behind the tests and the virus itself. And that's really contributing to a lot of discontent that we're currently seeing, out on the streets. Your viewers have maybe seen the protests at Queen's Park for people not wanting to wear masks and other aspects of this virus that have frustrated them, going all the way up to sort of government conspiracy. And so that's really challenging for public health officials who are asking us to continue to follow these measures and these rules.
This is the first pandemic of the social media era. We see a lot of posts going viral on social media and algorithms. What role does that play in amplifying COVID fatigue, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think it's really challenging. We've seen all kinds of things in, the American election. We talk about Russian bots and Twitter trolls. And I can tell you that it seems like there is a full mechanism on Twitter right now that is affecting Canadians, that does come through to Canadian listeners and viewers and those on social media, that is telling them that, this virus is a hoax, that this lockdown is unnecessary. And it's really important to counter that information, but it's very difficult when it's coming at people from all angles like that, and they may be mistrustful of mainstream media, people like me who try to provide solid scientific information and reasoning for lockdown measures. So I think it really does affect people. I have heard just in my own life, regular people say to me, is the pandemic that bad? And I think asking the question is important. And what's equally important is who they're asking the question to. And if they're looking to social media for the answer, I think that's a really big problem.
I was joking about this week has felt like a month, but for you, this week, you've had a really busy week. And I saw some of the interactions you had on social media. You're in the field, you're doing your job, and the frustration is being directed to you as a member of the media. So how do you contend with fed up people on social media lashing out at you when all you're trying to do is your job?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for mentioning that. I appreciate it. And it is difficult, obviously, when people challenge you in that way, in a disrespectful way, just for doing your job. There's a lot of people, like I said, who don't trust, what we call mainstream media. First of all, abusive people get blocked and reported, and I have a very supportive newsroom who helps me with that. And for people who are asking legitimate questions, who really are challenging, I try to send them the best information that I have about the reasons for this lockdown. And when people say, well, what scientific evidence? Then I try to send it to them, because the hope is that if they're asking the question, they maybe are willing to really hear the answer. But as far as Twitter trolls, my advice to everyone in my position, or who might, try to fight with someone who they see messaging someone like me or someone they know, is mostly just to ignore them.
And, Dr. Banerjee, when we do talk about the messaging, we've done a few shows on the confusing messages from public health officials. We're living in a social media era where disinformation is so available. Do you think that public health officials maybe need to pivot and try different social marketing techniques to try to cut through some of this noise and fatigue?
Yeah, I think so. I think what we're seeing is cracks in the public health system. As I said, we're seeing different messaging coming from federal levels, provincial, and municipal levels, and sometimes the messaging is contradictory. And people are seeing inconsistencies. Like you can have physical distancing, but bars can be open in some places. No mask, 2-layer mask, 3-layer mask. We're in lockdown, but in Quebec, you can have parties with 10 people, of different households. So I really believe that people want to do the right thing, but they're discouraged because the information is inconsistent and contradictory, and they don't know what to believe. So I think that what happens is that social media fills that void. Someone puts out an opinion, and it may be a conspiracy theory or another theory where it's not based on any evidence or facts, and then it gets amplified, and people think that it's facts, that there's some basis to it when it's really someone's opinion. Maybe the people who, physicians, epidemiologists, people that know the science should get out into social media and show the evidence. I think that people want to know why they're doing what they're doing, and that's based in something that's really going to make a difference for this pandemic.
And it seems too that we should be having a conversation also about trust. Jennifer, working in media, do you think that's part of the missing piece right now?
I think that's huge. I think that's so crucial right now. And it's really incumbent upon journalists like me to make sure that the public clearly understands what public health officials are asking them to do. And like I said, also understand the reasoning behind that. And one of the most difficult things in this pandemic has been that as journalists ourselves, we haven't always had that evidence because it hasn't always been provided to us. And I think that is the fault of public health officials and government officials, because if they want people to buy in, they need to show what they know to people like me so that I can break it down. I can call experts like Dr. Banerji and clearly explain what the measures are for and why they're being implemented. And, to explain things, like Dr. Banerji said, people were in lockdown earlier, it got better in the summer, and people are saying, well, why are we in lockdown again? And public health officials tell us that we should expect this virus to come in waves. It's not necessarily going to be a one-off thing until we get a vaccine. And to be able to clearly explain just how, the life cycle of a virus and how that works. And I think we all need to be doing better, because clearly people are dissatisfied and we see people now unwilling to follow the rules, even though I agree with Dr. Banerji that most people want to do their best and are maybe struggling with the communication.
Dr. Banerji, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I just think that we need to keep the message simple. It was very confusing. 10 people you can associate with in your bubble, 10 people you can associate with outside of your bubble, this many people here. It's very confusing. So I think you need to keep the messaging simple, consistent, and based on evidence. And I think that, people who know the evidence should go out there and try to amplify the evidence and their voices and help people understand why we're asking them to do what they're asked to do, that it's based on something that makes sense.
Well, this past week, Bonnie Lysyk, Auditor General of Ontario, released a pretty scathing report. I'd like to read a quote from a piece that Rob Ferguson wrote for the Toronto Star. Lysyk found the province's reaction to the pandemic was slowed by a cumbersome command structure that sidelines public health experts, including a chief medical officer who has not fully exercised his powers. The chief medical officer of health must also be given powers to use his or her expertise, free from political interference, to give direction and make decisions to protect the public where its health is at risk, Lysyk wrote. Dr. Banerji, how do we fight COVID fatigue with a public health unit that doesn't seem to be empowered?
Well, I think that there's a couple of comments I have about the report. I think that in general, no matter what we do, we can do our best. The virus is spreading, and the virus is spreading around the world. And some places are doing better, and some places are doing worse. The Auditor General's report, there was some criticism there, and I'll talk about some of my concerns. But some of the issues were longstanding. However, I do feel that the Ford government has been deaf to a lot of issues. And myself, I've actually, on several occasions, reached out to them. I've also talked to Dr. Tam and the municipal government, municipal public health, to say that these are concerns. And I'll tell you some of them. Like early in the pandemic, it was very clear to me that there were people that had false negative tests. So these are people who had classical symptoms of COVID. They had maybe a partner who was in the hospital with COVID. Clearly, there was nothing else they could have had. And so these were false negatives. And if you look in the literature, about 30% of the people with COVID actually have a negative test, when they do have COVID. Now that has implications for contact tracing and basically trying to control the outbreak. If you're only following the 70% of people that have positive tests, then you're missing the 30%. And I explained this several times to the provincial government, and they just again continuing. If your test is negative, you don't have COVID. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to do contact tracing. And I think that was an example of where this government wasn't listening. And the other example that I've experienced personally, which is a school situation, the physical distancing, where, all the rest of us are supposed to be physical distancing, but then you have a room with 30 kids and they're not physical distancing, despite all the input from the experts in the field, physicians, epidemiologists. And then they have rules where if a child has a viral illness, they go home for a day with a runny nose or sore throat, and then they can go back to school the next day. We know, first of all, children spread COVID. We know that in a large study done in India. We know that children often have mild symptoms of COVID, so just a runny nose or a sore throat. Now, the main circulating virus is COVID. And then most of these kids are not getting tested. So when Premier Ford says schools are safe and we have low numbers in school, well, we're not testing a lot of these kids, and we have false negatives. So I think that there's a lot of inconsistencies there.
I should just add that the Minister of Education, I believe it was yesterday, announced that kids in school will be tested. 30% is a high number. How does it happen, and why is it still so high?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why you have these false negatives. So part of it is, inherently the test is not perfect. And there have been studies, in other parts of the world that actually confirm that there are false negatives. And there was a study in New England Journal of Medicine that basically said if someone has risk factors, exposure, or symptoms, so they have a risk for COVID, ignore the test if it's negative and just assume that they have COVID. And so it can happen because the test, is not a perfect test, but also it depends on the viral load. So if someone is exposed and just starts having symptoms, often you don't pick it up on the first day. Then the viral load increases during the course of the illness, and it peaks after a couple of days, and then it goes down. So you can still be infectious and have COVID, but have a negative test. Also, it might depend on how someone does the test. It could be, issues in the lab. So there's a lot of reasons. But at the end of the day, when you have a third of the people that actually do have COVID, but their tests are negative, those are people that, and the problem is that they're being told, first of all, that they don't have COVID. So, these people have symptoms, they feel horrible, they wonder why they're feeling so sick, and people don't understand, well, your test is negative, you should be back at work. So that's one thing, for people coping, but also for infection spread. Basically, anyone who has symptoms that could be consistent with COVID needs to act like they have COVID, knowing that the test is not perfect. And so then I've been trying to say that to the provincial government, saying we should, anyone with symptoms, even with a negative test, should act as if they're COVID, because there's just so much COVID out there. It's the main circulating virus right now. And that's, if we're trying to control this infection, only dealing with the positives means that there's all these people here that have COVID that we're doing nothing for. And I think that's really important, but that message hasn't seemed to go through.
Jennifer, as someone who works in the media, your job is to disseminate the information to people, to tell them why they should listen to the advice. It's kind of like having two parents and they're not on the same page, but then the child being asked to do the right thing. How do you then, do you think that is part of the problem, why there is a fatigue, and maybe why people are deciding to take matters into their own hands?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. And I think this is a huge part of, this question you asked about public trust. And, our colleagues earlier, Kate Allen and Jennifer Yang, uncovered that the Ford government had not been following public health advice when he put in the initial thresholds, the different categories that put us in lockdown or in a red zone or, in a green zone, which is where we want to be. And that's really challenging because, again, I, as a journalist, am trying to show that there is public health advice to follow these measures. But when governments put in measures that aren't based on public health advice, it's really important. It's incumbent upon us as journalists to report that out as much as we can and to hold our government officials to account so that they do base these measures on public health advice so that the public can be confident in following them, that it is the right thing to do. But I do think that governments really erode public trust when they step away from public health advice and implement measures for other reasons, be it, for the sake of businesses or otherwise. And I think as journalists, we have that dual role that we have to tell you what public health officials are saying because it's based in sound medical and scientific advice. But if a government is asking a citizen to do something, it's up to us to ensure that they are asking them to do it for the right reasons.
And Dr. Banerji, just to follow up on my previous question following their Auditor General's report, as a public health official, do you feel like you're not empowered to do the best job that you can during this pandemic?
I mean, I think that a lot of the policies in place are not the best policies for controlling COVID. And I think that when you give that advice, not that my advice is the advice. There are many people that have advice, but I think that when the governments or the people administrating this are not listening at all to the advice, then it allows the infection to spread. And so that's frustrating in a way, because I think that things could have been done differently.
And so I guess it would be safe to say that you're also kind of experiencing your own COVID fatigue.
I am. I'm tired. I think we're all tired. I mean, I've, everything I do normally has changed, but I'm doing okay.
Okay. Jennifer, we've seen examples of non-compliance. You did cover this story of a restaurant in Etobicoke that decided to reopen. Do you think this is a result of lack of planning from officials, or is this another example of hoping that the public does the right thing?
I think it's both. I think a lot of the enforcement measures in place at a city level are sort of relying on a majority of residents to just do the right thing without having to be subject to enforcement. There's a lot of things like, not having 5 people over to your home right now. It's very difficult for any official to enforce that. It would be very hard for people to know if I'm doing that. And so we're relying on people to just not do that and to know that that is not a safe thing to do right now. But when it comes to this restaurant opening in Etobicoke, they were very public about the fact that they would be opening. They posted that on social media, along with some other unsubstantiated claims about the pandemic, and that has drawn quite a large crowd over the last few days. And that is because each day this restaurant owner has vowed to open and has been serving people food indoors, which is currently not allowed in Toronto under the lockdown. And it was surprising to me when I showed up the first day outside the restaurant and that public health officials weren't already on scene, ahead of opening when they knew that the restaurant would be closed at 11 and that the restaurant would be open at 11. And I think that, they're still figuring out how to deal with, brazen non-compliance like this. And I think it's been a struggle for them.
And Dr. Banerji, we've heard about, the struggles that public health officials are experiencing, nurses, doctors in hospitals trying to keep everybody safe. When you see something like this happening and you see all those people, he could have opened the restaurant and no one showed up, but people did show up. And I understand out of a city of many millions of people, that was a small number, but they are going to go back into their communities. As someone who's trying to keep everybody safe and you see this, what goes through your head?
Well, it's really disappointing. I think that I recognize that people are tired. I recognize that people are losing their livelihoods and they're frustrated. And I think that, but then again, people are ending up in the ICU and they're not making that connection that, their behavior directly or indirectly impacts people ending up in the hospital, having chronic symptoms due to COVID, the long haulers, or ending up having severe symptoms like it damaging their lungs, maybe for the rest of their life, or dying. And so you understand it, but we have to continue to combat that with proper information and rebuilding trust.
It's holiday season. I think it's safe to say everybody looks forward to the Christmas season. Maybe one the time of the year everybody can see everybody. Dr. Banerji, when you see that the Christmas season is coming up, the holiday season is coming up, how much worse is this going to get in the next few weeks, do you think?
Well, I think we need to buckle up. I think it's going to get worse in the next several weeks. I think this might be a very, very difficult winter. I think it's going to be hard for many people who are told you need to just basically stay where you're at, and that students really shouldn't be traveling. So it's a very different time of year. But I do think that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And if we can get through this next difficult period, I really do believe it will get better. And I think with the vaccine on the horizon, we know that there's some ambiguity as far as when it might happen. But the fact that there is a vaccine for this, there's some viruses we don't have vaccines for, but that there is a vaccine. It seems to show promising impact as far as reducing COVID. It works to some degree or another. So I think that's very positive.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have the ears of Ontarians. What would you say to Ontarians who are watching this program and listening about how to manage the next few weeks?
I think it's really important to recognize that COVID fatigue is real. We're all really tired, and I think the anxiety, the stress that people are feeling, it's real, and I understand. It's probably justified. It's been difficult. A lot of people feel hopeless, but I think I want to reiterate that this is going to end, and I believe it's going to end in the next few months. To the degree we're not going to be where we're at, I think, in March or in the next few months. We just need to get through it. And I think that there are things that people can do to try to help. I know I don't want to minimize anyone's suffering, but I think that for me personally, what I do is I take stock of what I have. And I think every day I think about gratitude. And I think that all of us can try to support local businesses, restaurants. I think the federal government, if they can try to keep the businesses open for the next little while, support them, not keep them open, but keep them floating for the next little while. If we can support people to stay at home when they're sick, then that reduces the spread. I think also this is an opportunity that we may not have again until we retire. We actually have some free time. Maybe some people don't because they're working and they've got their kids, but for a lot of people, they have free time. So maybe take that course that you wanted to, a photography course, start writing, go outside, go for walks, get bundled up, go for walks, go through your address book and find friends that you haven't called in a long time and keep in touch with them, or have Zoom calls, reach out to each other. I think journaling is a good idea. There are things that we can do that can help us get through this difficult time.
I think it's important for all of us to know that we are going through this, different people in different ways, but this is something that will not go away if we're all not on the same page. Jennifer, do you think that the promise, Dr. Banerji mentioned the vaccine, do you think that the promise of a vaccine looming on the horizon might relieve some of this anxiousness that people are feeling right now?
I do think it helps people feel a little more hopeful. I've had these conversations with my friends and family, but I think that when we're talking about it with each other and when media is talking about it, we need to remind people that it's another reason to keep being vigilant as we go through the winter. It's not the time to kind of give up and get sloppy just because the vaccine is on the way. That would be a real shame if things got really out of control before the vaccine arrived, but it is a reason to kind of hold on and have hope. And I agree with Dr. Banerji that, I'm saying this as a white person with a lot of privilege, and there are people in this city who are really struggling, who have to go to work at an essential job out in the world every day. But to the extent that we can, practice some form of mindfulness at home, whether that's going for a run, doing something, that's low barrier, low cost, home exercises, home meditation, and checking out from the news cycle every once in a while. And I know that's weird coming from a journalist, but it is important to turn off and spend time with your family, or if you can call someone if you live alone, and maybe go for, just a walk out in nature like Dr. Banerji suggested, and just to continue to follow the advice until we get through this.
Dr. Banerji, like you said, with gratitude, I always try to find something about silver linings, every day having a silver lining. We really do appreciate both of your time and are so grateful for the work that you're both doing. Thank you so much for your insights, and take good care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
For over a century, Indigenous languages were not simply marginalized, they were actively suppressed. That is changing. With us now for more, Shelby Lisk. She is our Ontario Hub's journalist covering Indigenous issues, and she joins us from Ottawa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Jan.
So your latest for TVO.org looks at 3 families learning 3 different Indigenous languages to reconnect with their culture. Tell us, why did you want to write this series?
Yeah, so actually 1 year ago, TVO started the initiative to translate as many articles as we can from the Indigenous Hub into Indigenous languages. So when I'm writing a story about a community, we try to translate it into the language from that community. So right now we have translators for Ojibwe, Mohawk, Lenape, a couple of dialects of Cree, and now we also have a translator for Oneida Sign Language, which you'll see in this story. So this project is pretty special to me because my very first article that I wrote for TVO was actually the very first article that they translated for this project, and it was translated into Mohawk, which is my language. So that was just really amazing for me to see when I first started working here. So we knew that for the 1 year anniversary of the translation project, we wanted to do something special. And I've had this idea in the back of my head, just thinking about how we pass languages through generations and who takes on that role. And so I really wanted to explore that with these 3 families that I interviewed.
Well, I want to talk about one of the families. You spoke to Karen Moscow. Now, she is one of the very few people who speaks Lenape. What did her story teach you about the role families have in passing down language?
Yeah, so I really connected with Karen because she is also, I'm an auntie, I don't have any children of my own, and she kind of has the same story. So we really connected on, in Mohawk, there's no word to differentiate mom from aunt. And in Lenape, they have a similar word. They call their aunt their little mom. And so that's sort of the role that she really takes on within her family. And, when she was talking to me about what family meant to her, she really talked about it being community. And when she was growing up, her parents always took in lots of foster children, people from the community, kids from the community were always staying with them. And she said that they always had enough children in their house to have 2 baseball teams to play against each other. So that's what she remembers growing up. And she's really taken on that role within her family and within her community as well. And one of the other things that she really emphasized to me about family that I thought was really important is that she teaches in her community, and she doesn't separate adults and children in her classes, because she said that's not how we naturally would have learned languages. We always would have been all together, which I think is really beautiful.
Now, I want to speak about another family, one family that's reviving and expanding sign language for the Oneida Nation. What can you tell us about the Ireland family?
Yeah, so the Irelands, they're from the Oneida Nation of the Thames community near London, Ontario. And Max and Marcia Ireland, well, they're adorable. They've been together for 40 years. And Marcia was born deaf, and she struggled a lot because she didn't really feel like she fit into the deaf community. She described it as being a very white community where she didn't feel like she fit in as an Indigenous person. And then at the same time, she also felt disconnected from the Oneida community because she would bring interpreters for ASL to community events. But as soon as a speaker started speaking in the Oneida language, the translators had to stop. They didn't know what was going on. And so that was, cutting her off from her community. They also have 5 children, all of whom are deaf, and they have 8 of their 12 grandchildren are also deaf, and they just had a great-granddaughter who was born also deaf. So they have 4 generations of deaf people within their family. And that also really pushed Marcia, watching her children growing up, and they would watch elders, telling stories in the community, but they couldn't understand what was happening. And so all of these things really pushed Marcia to create this Oneida Sign Language.
So I actually want to show a short clip of Marcia teaching Oneida Sign Language. I do want to let our viewers who are joining us on podcast that there is no sound to this video. Sheldon, can we please roll? All right, so after looking at that, can you explain what Marcia was signing?
Yeah, so in that clip, she's signing Happy National Indigenous Peoples Day. And her and I talked a lot about the sign for Indigenous because, growing up, she learned the ASL sign for Indian, which she described to me as sort of, you make the letter F with an ASL and it's kind of a movement on your cheek. And she never really felt like that sign, connected her to her culture. And so she created this sign, which she feels, much more connected to. And so the sign for Indigenous, your left hand represents the land and your right hand comes in and represents the water and then the roots. And I think that it's just so beautiful and visual. And that's the sign that she now uses for Indigenous. And she says that really gives her a sense of pride in who she is.
That's very beautiful. Now, I want to talk about the third series, and it's the third language you looked at, which was Ojibwe. And unlike Lenape or OSL, it's a fairly commonly spoken Indigenous language here in Canada. Why did you write about the Allen family?
Yeah, so I found this family and I was really inspired by Rochelle Allen because she was a really beginner language learner, but when she had her children, she just decided, no, I want to raise them in the language anyway. So she's kind of learning Ojibwe at the same time as she's teaching it to them as they grow up. And, she said to me, I could wait until I'm fluent, but then my children would grow up without the language. And she didn't want that. So I just found it really inspiring that, she just started where she was and just did it.
Now, one of the things that she's been doing is producing videos. Now, we have one video where she's doing a little stretch with her kids. Sheldon, can we roll that?
Shibin.
Annie.
She begotten. She begotten. She begotten.
당연한 것이다.
Magic, niche, niswit, niwen, namen.
Besides being super, super adorable, what can adults, and an example, the Allen family, learn from children when it comes to learning languages and a new language?
Yeah, Rochelle talked a lot about how, she doesn't know she could have done this without her children. And a lot of the language learning techniques she learned to teach them actually helped her learn the language so much better. And these are some things that as adults, we're not as patient as children when they're learning a language. We don't just want to sit there and try to read and mess up. We really want to get it really quickly because we want to communicate. We like communicating. And so one of the things she talked about even was just, reading books to her son over and over when he was really young. And she didn't really understand what she was reading, but that's the same way kids learn. They read it over and over and over again, and they're just absorbing the language, even though they're not quite sure what's going on.
Shelby, I want to thank you so much. Again, another important story. Our viewers can check that out on tbo.org. Shelby Lisk joining us from Ottawa, our Ontario Hub journalist covering Indigenous issues. Thank you again.
Thanks, Jan.
The agenda this week looked at why conspiracy theories hurt real victims of human trafficking and assessed how to make capitalism more equitable. The agenda's Week in Review begins with a critical eye on how Ontario's managed the COVID-19 crisis in long-term care.
Long-term care deaths account for 2/3 of the deaths from COVID-19 in this province. There are 626 long-term care homes in Ontario, of which more than 400 have had outbreaks. Now, a reminder, one case is considered an outbreak. At the start of this week, 101 homes had outbreaks. That's about 16% of the province's homes. And as of Monday of this week, there were 528 residents and 467 staff members with the virus. Now, let's start with this. The province's official line is, yes, we're into a second wave of COVID-19, but we did learn a lot of lessons the first time around, and therefore we're doing much better this time around. I want to start with a basic question. True or false? Dr. Sinha, start us off.
Well, I think, the second wave, we're seeing more deaths again, we're seeing more outbreaks, and sadly, we're seeing a lot of the issues that weren't addressed in the first wave that are creeping back to hit us again in the second wave. And I really think it's just unparalleled levels of community transmission and the staffing issues that really haven't been resolved that I think are the Achilles heel of a good pandemic response. That's why I think we're seeing outbreaks again and preventable deaths once again.
Charlene Stewart, we're doing better this time. True or false?
False. For all reasons. They didn't do enough preparedness over the summer. The things that they did were verbal commitments, but we're not seeing the actions implemented inside the homes. We're seeing a more critical staff shortage. It's been reported that 30% of the staff that were there during the first wave are not returning during the second wave. So it is worse. I mean, some of the lessons learned, like the low wages, there was a commitment to address that, but the piecemealing way that we're dealing with this pandemic is not making any improvements. Things are actually worse.
Dr. Auditor, what do you say? True or false?
Yeah, so absolutely. I would agree with the other panelists that our response has been piecemeal, ad hoc, and really far too late in many of the homes that have large-scale COVID-19 outbreaks. So really, it's false. And we could have done much better over the summer and learned even from other provinces that had a much better response.
Well, Donna Duncan, I've left you for the end for obvious reasons. I wanted you to hear what everybody else had to say first. How do you weigh in on this?
Certainly, we're better off in knowing about asymptomatic spread and PPE and testing, but we have a critical staffing shortage right now, and we still have old buildings, and we know that the root cause is in wave one, where we had community spread, old buildings, and staffing shortages. So we have a lot to do to still stabilize the sector.
Tell me what you think, Donna, has changed in terms of how long-term care homes are better prepared this time around than during the first wave. What's different now?
Certainly the response for help is much faster this time. In the first wave, it wasn't until the middle of April that we were able to get reinforcements in. Certainly we've been working with the government to say, we can't wait days, we can't wait weeks, we can't wait months. When we know that we have an outbreak that may be escalating, we need to get help as quickly as possible. And certainly working with public health and with hospitals and local communities, especially where we have large outbreaks, that helps going in more quickly. And we need that.
Samir, we know that when the Canadian military was called in earlier this year, that report really revealed some pretty horrifying stuff. In fact, I think Premier Ford said at the time it was the scariest report he'd ever seen. Heart-wrenching, I think, actually is more accurate of what he said. In your view, since then, what's changed?
There's been a greater recognition about how vulnerable long-term care homes are. And as you mentioned, that we've seen the majority now have experienced an outbreak, and we've seen over 2,300 deaths now occurring, in these settings. So this is a real challenge that we've really had to struggle with. But I think the key is that the government is making commitments. They're saying we recognize that we have to improve staffing. We recognize that we need more supports for the sector, that we have to actually increase the levels of care we're providing. The key is that, how do we actually make those structural commitments happen quickly and in a timely way and really change the overall culture of long-term care, where we saw in that military report, staff talking about a culture of fear, staff being told by some operators, don't use the PPE, it's too expensive, for example, and a culture where staff just feel that they're not being supported. So as Charlene said, 30%, 1 in 3 of the 100,000 staff members that, were working perhaps, in our homes in the first wave are not returning. That's a huge problem. And that really tells us that a lot of people, the staff included, are losing confidence in the sector. And we have to change that quickly.
Charlene, how much of that happens? How much of staff being told, don't use PPE, it's too expensive, use it sparingly? How much of that do we really hear?
Yeah, unfortunately, it still does happen. And again, with the outbreaks, the ability to get a hold of higher grade like N95s is still a challenge. The infection prevention control measures in the homes, because of the crisis in the staffing, is not good enough. They've got staff working on multiple floors, using the same mask that they've used on, say, an infected floor. Because of the staffing shortages, they have to spread those staff among many floors, and that is a bad way to contain a virus or a presumed virus.
You know, having said that, Amit, I do remember Brian Mulrooney once saying, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. So let's find out, relatively speaking, how Ontario is doing vis-a-vis other provinces. On that score, what do you find?
Well, I think really the gold standard that we can compare ourselves to is British Columbia, which acted very early on in the pandemic back in March to take critical actions. They acted decisively with clear communication for the entire long-term care sector, specifically when it came to public health supports, infection control, and prevention, along with staffing. What they did is they nationalized the long-term care sector, which means that the government actually hired all frontline long-term care workers, made sure that they were only working in one home, being paid a decent living wage, benefits, and sick leave. And consequently, through the first wave, what happened is that they have half of the long-term care sector, but had 1/10 of the deaths.
I want to read part of an open letter written by Freedom Needs Truth. This is a coalition of organizations dedicated to fighting human trafficking, and this is about the dangers of QAnon conspiracy theories before the last election. I think most people have heard of QAnon now. Here we go. Anybody, political committee, public office holder, candidate, or media outlet who lends any credibility to QAnon conspiracies related to human trafficking actively harms the fight against human trafficking. Let's get into that. Ronelle, how do the QAnon types harm the fight against human trafficking?
Well, what QAnon does and any sort of human trafficking conspiracy theories is really paints a picture of what trafficking looks like. But this picture is not reflective of the reality. And so stories of international child trafficking rings or people being kidnapped off the street. And even though these things do happen, the way trafficking normally looks like, what we're seeing particularly here in Canada, so domestic sex trafficking, is that young people are being trafficked by someone that they know. It's a family member, it's a boyfriend, it's a girlfriend. It's not somebody being kidnapped off the street by a stranger, and it's not likely someone's going to be involved in an international child sex trafficking ring.
Ronelle, do you know why they do this?
Why they make up these conspiracy theories?
Yeah.
I think because, particularly with sex trafficking, it is such a complex crime. It's something that's very hard for most people to understand. How could someone be victimized in this way? And so these conspiracy theories, to me, they're trying to simplify something that is so overly complicated in a way that most people will say, okay, this is what trafficking looks like. I can get behind that.
Julia, what impact do these conspiracy organizations have on your organization?
So as we mentioned, the common myths that already exist around human trafficking are not helpful to start off with. So again, many Canadians believe that this is an issue of foreign nationals or women being brought into the country and being trafficked here. As mentioned, that's just simply not the case. This is a domestic issue. This is a national issue. And again, like Ronelle said, this is usually happening through someone that the individuals know and trust. So when these conspiracy theories go out, what it does is it fuels that fire of myths, and it really detracts from us being able to focus on the issue at hand in front of us, which again is incredibly complex.
Do you know, Lauren, why QAnon types seem to focus so much on pedophilia rings and human trafficking? This seems to be their thing.
Well, I think there's two things going on. So from the perspective of Q and those who are politically aligned with this source and promoting the conspiracy, they are just taking advantage of this to promote their political agenda, to gain support. Why it works is because in conspiracy theories in general, people are very interested in getting involved in a group that they think is involved in some kind of salvific function. They're going to save the world. They're a small group of people who have special knowledge and insight, and they're going to overcome a sort of great ignorance in the world, and they're going to rescue, particularly, the appeal is that they're going to rescue the innocent. They're going to rescue those who are being abused. So a large number of conspiracy theories or political propaganda in general usually uses motifs about women and children being raped, tortured, sexually molested, exploited, killed, etc., in order to galvanize this desire to come to the rescue of these people on the part of the audience.
Now, Julia, since this group has gained attention, in part because they endorsed Trump, in part because he retweeted some of their stuff on Twitter, have you been getting an increase in calls to your organization because of that?
So usually about 48 hours after a new hashtag comes out, like Save the Children or some of the conspiracy theories around Wayfair, we will get an influx in calls to the hotline. Luckily, we're not experiencing to the same degree as they are in the States with their anti-human trafficking hotline. So it's not actually disrupting our ability to serve other folks who might be victims or survivors on the ground. But we definitely see it. And in all honesty, we take it as an opportunity to share education and awareness about what human trafficking really is. But we definitely get people from across Canada, family members and just general folks, asking if this is real.
One of the points your book makes is that this is obviously unfair in terms of economic performance, but it's also, you suggest, a problem for democracy. How so?
Well, if you think about it, that great middle class that's sort of the underpinning of every advanced democratic capitalist country also happens to be the swing voter. Right. If you think about the median family, the 50th percentile, in some sense, the government in power needs to have that voter on its side, or at least the voters in that narrow band around it. And if suddenly that narrow band has stopped advancing, they may fundamentally ask, hey, why am I continuing to vote for the continuation of this thing that isn't working for me, isn't working for my family anymore? And if that happens, you'll have an electorate saying, well, maybe we'll try something else. It happened, in the Great Depression, right? In the Great Depression, which was a worldwide phenomenon in advanced countries around the world, much of Europe, much of the Far East went either fascist, socialist, or communist during that period. So when you have a middle class that says this isn't working for us anymore, they're prone to try other things.
Well, okay, but the conventional wisdom has always been, yeah, but that could never happen over here. The terrible recession of the 1980s didn't result in a change of style of government. The Great Recession of 15 years ago didn't result in a change of style of government. Here we are again with the economic dislocation caused by COVID. We don't see people, clamoring in the streets for a change of, I don't mean a change of party. I mean like literally a change in the system by which we are governed. Are you concerned that could no longer be the case?
Yeah, and I think, Steve, if you look at the polls that question people about socialism, they have higher favorability than ever before in America, and it ain't even close. So I think it's upon us, to be honest.
There's a lot more financial mobility in Scandinavia than there is over in North America. Is that the point?
Considerably more financial mobility and even more social mobility, which is sort of blows up that myth that the U.S. has always lived on, that they have the best mobility and the easiest path for every citizen to become wealthy. That hasn't been true for a long time.
Michael, you wanted to follow up?
Well, I think that's a good point Brian makes about intergenerational mobility. In fact, it's significantly higher in Canada than the United States as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask our director here, Sheldon Osmond, to put up a graph, and then Shannon, I'll get you to speak to it first. This is essentially, was tweeted out by the Financial Times back on November 17th. And essentially, again, I'm going to describe this a bit for people who can't see it and who are listening on podcast. It seems that the older you are, the more you are satisfied with democracy. So if we go to the top right corner of this graph, you see a blue squiggly line there, the interwar generation, 1918 to 1943, high levels of satisfaction. Baby boomers are the next ones down, 1944 to 64. Again, pretty decent level of satisfaction with the way democracy works. But then we get into younger groups. Generation X, 1965 to 1980, less and less satisfaction. And the millennials, born 1981 to 1996, considerable dissatisfaction with the way society works. Shannon, I guess I want to know from you, do you believe, based on your interactions with this generation, that they, it's legitimate for them to feel that way?
It's a great question. I think everyone loves the idea of critical thought in a democracy, but I think specifically to democratic capitalism, this was even mentioned in the interview, that something is not working. So people are being left behind, and the younger generation is feeling that polarization of the wealthy getting wealthy and the monopolies that have been created with big, huge, massive corporations. And they're feeling like they don't have the same hope. They're not going to do better than their parents' generation, which is this massive shift that's happened. And so I do agree that the younger generations, and even into Gen X and the conversations that I'm having on the front line of financial planning, there is a disillusionment with the current system. And to the interviewer's point, when people are disillusioned and things become polarized, people want to try new things. And I think that I agree with that. And I hear it often, all the time. And people are nervous about the future.
Brian, can I get you to react to that tweet that we put up a while ago, that the older you are, the more satisfied you are with the way democracy works? The younger you are, the less satisfied you are. How concerned should we all be about those numbers?
Well, I think the numbers are accurate. I think if you talk to anybody these days in their 20s, especially if they've just come out of university in the middle of this pandemic, they have real concerns about how they're going to manage, and their incomes are uncertain. Their job prospects are really uncertain these days, and they are disillusioned because they were promised something better many years ago. But I think it's also true that older people who are happier with democratic capitalism are older people who are pretty well off. If you go to older poor people, they're just as miserable as everybody in the younger set. So I don't think it's widely true.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, November 27th, 2020. Next week, we'll hear from Ontario's Minister of Health, assess this country's capacity for manufacturing vaccines, and check in on the science of HIV today for World AIDS Day. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman. And by viewers like you. Thank you.